Welcome to the Partners Table, where we connect with the brightest financial minds shaping the future of investing. I'm your host, Jesse Roldan. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered financial, legal, or tax advice. Please consult your own advisors and review the full disclosure in the description before making any decisions. The opinions and views expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official positions or institutional views of Zynergy or its affiliates. Today's episode is deeply relevant for any accredited investors and high net worth individuals thinking about legacy, because we're talking not just about how wealth is built, but how it's passed on. Our guest today is Paul Roldan, founder of Algen Financial, a values-driven firm that's helped families across the U.S. navigate long-term planning with clarity and integrity. Mr. Roldan is, if you couldn't tell by his last name, also my father and someone whose perspective on stewardship, legacy, and generational alignment has shaped not just my career, but my life. Welcome to the Partners Table, Mr. Roldan. We're so glad to have you on.
Good to be here, Jesse.
To begin, let's ground this conversation in something deeper than just dollars or documents, but what legacy really means beneath the surface. A lot of people think about legacy in terms of inheritance or asset transfer, but when you've worked with families over time, how do you help them reframe legacy more holistically?
Well, I think it's important that the definition or the use of those words you just said, asset transfer or legacy, go beyond the very superficial element of materialism, which is, oh, we think assets as physical things, money or land or cars, etc. Because an asset can be so much more, intellectual capacity, that's an asset that you can help pass on and nurture during a lifetime. So I think one of the things we've done is really take the conversation of legacy and asset transfer to say, how do we transfer something beyond that? As we know historically and statistically, when you look at wealthy families that pass on generational wealth, okay, and we're talking about material wealth, statistically speaking, at the third generation, they tend to squander it all. Okay, and that's because the other transfer I think doesn't happen, which is a transfer of meaning, of purpose, of values, okay, of intentional design for a betterment of society, impact of community, faith-oriented, purpose behind what wealth represents to them. Okay, so when we give advice at Algen from a financial planning standpoint, I have people say, I ask them, how can I help you? It's a first time conversation. Oh, I want to increase my wealth or my money. Okay, great. Why? Because it's good. Well, yes, it's good, but why? Like, what are you going to do with it? You increase your wealth, and then what? What does that mean? Because my goal there is to immediately start framing the conversation of it's not just about accumulation, but it's about impact and significance and purpose. That's what really drives home to me the importance of accumulation and amassing wealth, but to be able to do something with it. You've seen a lot of wealthy people who are not happy in life, but that's because there's something missing there. Okay, we understand that financial means opens doors. Yes, absolutely. But opening a door, but doing it with purpose, design, and meaning behind it, and having the effect and the power to change other people's lives, I think really brings a satisfaction like no other.
Absolutely. Understanding that why behind legacy is essential. But to kind of shift gears a little bit, I think the how is where things often get complicated, especially when family dynamics come into play. It's easier to decide what's going to happen to your assets during estate planning when no one else is involved, but what happens when the individual's expectations don't align with those of the beneficiaries? How do you approach those differences?
Well, that's you bring up a good point because you're talking about two different parties, right? The ones leaving and the ones acquiring or inheriting. And a lot of times estate planning and legacy transfer is done in a vacuum. Okay, it's I'm the one passing it on. So here's what I would like to see happen, would like to see happen. Okay, and then yes, there are mechanics by which you can control some of that outcome. You do a trust with very specific directives. Okay, well, you don't get this much, or X amount goes to this charity. So that's one way to do it. Just lock it down and really have a tightly knit, very specific, directive-oriented trust that really delineates exactly what do you want to see happen. But to me, that's great. Okay, that's a start. But I think it's more powerful when you can actually connect the dots, create a bridge of understanding of that transfer of legacy beyond the money between the different generations. Okay, so what does that require? It requires a conversation. And this is the hard part because sometimes family dynamics are very tough when it comes to having conversations about money, and then about death, and things of that nature. So avoidance is very typical, but we encourage not to avoid those conversations, but highly encourage to have them and have them early. I mean, at Alden, we do a summer camp for teenagers. Not to have that conversation, but start making them aware of money dynamics so it doesn't become as awkward, and you can start enhancing their awareness and understanding of what money means and how it works in society. Even charitable giving, we teach them that, okay, the power of being able to impact the community around them. So I think it's important to, yes, you can do the mechanical lockdown of things, but I think it's important to have a conversation with families about money and make it something hopefully more natural starting earlier than just this one-time event that kind of makes it awkward and offshoot and doesn't really transfer much in terms of behavior or passions or desires for what we would like to see have happen.
So it's good to get the next generation involved early on in this planning. But even with the best structure in place, I'm sure legacy can falter if the next generation isn't necessarily ready or willing to receive it. So many families worry that wealth will either spoil their kids or become too overwhelming for them to manage. So, how do you advise families to involve their sons and or daughters in the process early on without creating dependency?
Well, I think you hit the key word there, dependency at the end. You have to create and be intentional about this, an environment of learning, of appreciation, and of valuing and responsibility. All those are critical elements for good stewardship moving forward. So what does that mean? When I say have the conversation early, that doesn't mean, okay, hey, son, you're 12, let's talk about the millions you're going to inherit. No, no, it's not that. The conversation has to be intentional in terms of staging it in at the child, adults capacity, okay, but with some groundwork of a responsibility being groomed as you go. Okay, when I say we have a camp for teenagers, well, that's one level of conversation, which is more educational. What is this? What is debt? How can debt be bad and awful? What is consumerism? Okay, what is, impact? What is charitable giving? Things of that. So you start building a repertoire of intellectual capacity that then can be translated into a manifest. One thing is knowledge, but then you have to create wisdom, right? The application of knowledge is wisdom. So when you have a good knowledge base, how you create intentional scenarios where they can apply the wisdom? Okay, I remember hearing a story of a very wealthy man whose son was in high school and as a senior, um, got him a car. It's a very old used car that would literally shut off when he stopped at red lights. Okay. So the son had to be creative on one, planning his time to get to and from school, okay, because he had to be on time. That was a requirement. And then he was a little embarrassed, so he would be creative and go to the paths that he has to plan his trips, make sure there was the least lights possible, okay. And then part of it was an ego thing. He didn't want his friends to see him either. But the father, was being very intentional about having that son own, okay, different responsibilities, and then be appreciative because when he got a better car, so grateful. Okay, it still wasn't a brand new car, but the gratitude of saying, I don't deserve anything, okay, but I am blessed, to be able to have this. I appreciate that. And then that changes your paradigm and your perspective on yourself, on wealth, and those around you, and those that may or may not have as much as you. Then it becomes a whole different dynamic and interaction of how do we make the world a better place.
Hearing how important that intentionality is with children is so helpful and actually leads me to my next question. When most people think about legacy, they focus on their own children or grandchildren, but have you seen families think about legacy in terms of community impact or causes beyond the family itself? How do you help them integrate that into their planning?
Yeah, no, I have seen that. Obviously, most people think of how do I pass on my estate to my heirs, right? My children. But if you can actually take that to another level, a new dimension, and say, how do I now pass it on to my community at large, to the world at large, not exclude my heirs necessarily, okay, but being intentional about having a greater reach, I think that's powerful. And I've seen that. For example, I have someone I know who would sit down with his children every year and would give them money. And I say give them, quote unquote, but he would tell them, okay, you have this much that you have to give away. Who do you want to give it to? It could be one or multiple, organizations. And he would do this through a DAF, a donor advised fund that he would say, look, this is how much is in the DAF. Let's give together. Okay. And that was a joyous celebratory moment during the holidays that, again, turns the focus away from what can I receive, during Christmas as a gift versus what can I give, and giving it to nonprofits, that are going to help the world, whether it's the homeless or whatever your heart is called to do. I think that requires intentionality, but I've seen people do that. I mean, I've obviously seen people be a little more technical and saying, okay, I'm going to take part of my estate, create a charitable remainder trust, and leave this part to this nonprofit, whether it be my church or another nonprofit directly, and having that conversation with your heirs as well, so they can be involved and aware that that existed as part of your heart. I think that's powerful. I mean, to bring it home, one day I had you and your brother got to the house during Christmas, and I don't know how many people can relate to this. There's the Charlie Brown Peanuts Christmas story where Charlie Brown has to pick a Christmas tree and he picks probably the most humble Christmas tree in the whole lot. Everybody rags on him. So I bought one of those Christmas trees. So one is a twig, right? And it has one ball on it. So you guys get to the house ready to see your gifts and unwrap all the gifts that you had made a list for Santa. Okay. And there's this little Christmas tree and one gift each, one gift for each of you. And I was just watching your faces and to see you were so good about it because you could clearly tell this was not what you expected, okay? But you still dealt with it in a great demeanor, great attitude, say, thank you, Dad, thank you, Dad. And that, of course, moved me to say, okay, you earned the rest of the gifts I'm going to give you, and you're happy to receive those. But again, taking the focus away from what it is supposed to be mine, from me receiving, to being intentional about teaching the power of giving. I've seen people do that in different ways, and I think it's huge as far as future impact.
Yeah, it's so important to instill a giving mindset in children at a young age. I love those examples and appreciate your thoughtful approach as I was growing up. Now, to wrap things up, in your experience, what are some of the biggest regrets people have when it comes to legacy planning? And how can families avoid those regrets before it's too late?
Yeah, this is gonna sound cliche-ish, but I think the biggest regret is summed up in that phrase. I could wish I woulda, coulda, shoulda. That time where people, after X amount of experience and growing in wisdom, they realize, oh my goodness, I don't think my heirs, my children are ready to receive what I've been able to build up, to get an inheritance without squandering it. So I think that's been the biggest regret that people didn't take the time to be intentional about teaching the next generation, their family members, about the power of being able to not just receive for the sake of receiving, but actually have meaning behind it. And again, as I've said throughout, it takes intentionality, it takes time, but the earlier you can start, the better. And hopefully, if you can do that, you won't have that regret that later in life, once it's a certain stage, it's a lot harder to implement because it's harder to teach a 60-year-old, to be giving than to start teaching a 5-year-old to have that disposition in life.
That's such a powerful perspective to hear. And on that note, Mr. Roldan, Dad, thank you for your leadership and example and for sharing your voice here at the Partners Table.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us at the Partners Table. If you found this conversation valuable, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. If you're ready to explore new investment opportunities, please visit our website, Zynergy.com, to discover how we can help you deploy capital with purpose. I'm Jesse Roldan, and we'll see you next time.